The applause was still echoing when I realized no one was clapping for me. "Let's welcome our new director, Susan," Harold announced, his smile stretching wide, the kind of smile that fed on my silence. I sat there, hands folded, while colleagues shook Susan's hand as if I didn't exist. 15 years of late nights, of saving deals no one else could save, erased in one sentence. My chest tightened, my throat burned, but I kept my face calm. Then I reached into my briefcase, pulled out an envelope, and placed it on the table. Harold barely glanced at it. He didn't know he was holding the beginning of his own ruin. I wake before the alarm most mornings. Habit, I guess. My apartment is quiet, too quiet sometimes, the kind of silence that makes you aware of the hum of the refrigerator or the faint drip of the bathroom tap. I brew tea, never coffee, it leaves me jittery, and stand by the window watching the city stir awake. Yellow buses. Men in suits walking too fast. Women balancing coffee cups and phones. Everyone rushing to someplace they believe matters. For years, I believed Meridian solutions mattered more than anything. By the time I lock my door and head out, my routine is already drilled into muscle memory. The metro ride is 25 minutes, long enough for me to skim through the company reports on my tablet. I like facts. Numbers don't betray you, not like people do. Walking into the glass doors of Meridian still does something to me. Even after all these years, they shine tall and clean, the logo etched in silver above the reception desk. I remember being 25 the first time I pushed them open. Hair in a neat bun, my mother's pearl earrings for luck, and a leather portfolio my father had given me as a graduation gift. I'd felt like I was stepping into my future, and for a while it almost felt true. Back then, Harold was younger, hungrier, pretending to be a mentor. He'd call me his secret weapon, pour himself whiskey after a client win, and say, "Patricia, you're going to run this place someday." I saved those emails, every one of them. Proof that my work mattered. Proof that my sacrifices were worth it. Sacrifices. That's the word that echoes when I look back. I worked late nights polishing presentations until my eyes stung. Weekends, I volunteered for projects no one else wanted. When a client threatened to leave, I flew out on my own dime and saved the account. I thought each success was a brick in the road toward leadership. At home, though the bricks were crumbling, my ex-husband Robert used to say, "You love that job more than you love me." He wasn't wrong. I'd come home after midnight to find him asleep on the couch, TV flickering blue shadows across his face. Sometimes he'd wait up just to ask, "Do you even see me anymore?" I didn't have an answer. The divorce papers came 3 years ago. I signed them in a lawyer's office that smelled like leather and dust, then went straight to work. Harold needed quarterly projections updated. No time for grief when the numbers wouldn't balance themselves. After Robert left, the apartment became just a place to sleep and shower. Meridian became everything else. My stage, my punishment, my proof of existence. I arrived earlier, stayed later, filled the quiet with deadlines and Harold's endless demands. Doctor's appointments for him. Dry cleaning for him. Even his wife's charity gala, because I was so good with details. I told myself it was temporary, that one day it would pay off. That loyalty had a price, and eventually, I'd be rewarded. But the truth? Loyalty was my cage. And Harold had the key. I wasn't always invisible. There was a time when Harold trusted me more than anyone. I remember the London deal 5 years ago. The client was threatening to pull out, and Harold froze. We were in a sleek boardroom 30 floors up, the air thick with tension. He whispered to me, "I don't know how to flip this." And I did. I spoke calmly, laid out the numbers, showed them the long-term profit they were blind to. By the end, the client shook Harold's hand, congratulating him on his brilliant strategy. That night, Harold raised a glass of scotch in the hotel bar and said, "Patricia, you just saved this company. I owe you big." That word "oh" stayed with me, because slowly, I realized he never meant to repay it. Instead, he began using me as a shadow. I was the one drafting emails he signed. The one who sat through tedious dinners with difficult clients while he slipped away early. The one who whispered corrections into his ear mid-presentation, so he wouldn't embarrass himself. He got the applause. I got the exhaustion. But I told myself, Patience. Your turn will come. Then came Susan. She was younger, loud in meetings, all bright colors and quick smiles. I remember the first time Harold introduced her. Patricia, this is Susan, our rising star. She'll be shadowing you. I nodded politely, but something twisted inside me. Shadowing me? I had given years of my life. Now I was reduced to a stepping stone for someone who'd been here less than 12 months. At first, I tried to help her. I shared templates, explained client quirks, even proofread her work. But the more I gave, the more she took. One afternoon, I overheard Harold on the phone, his voice low but sharp. Yes, Susan handled it brilliantly. She's a natural. Far better instincts than Patricia. I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart hammering. He was talking about the proposal I had stayed up until 3 a.m. drafting. Susan had only delivered it. It didn't stop there. At the annual gala, when the CEO praised our exceptional new talent, Susan, I clapped like everyone else, but my palms stung with betrayal. Later, Harold leaned close and whispered, "Don't look so bitter, Patricia. You're steady, reliable. Susan's the one with flair. Clients love her. Don't be jealous. It's unbecoming." Unbecoming. That word sliced deeper than I expected. Like everything I had built was suddenly reduced to something pitiful, something shameful. Still, I swallowed it. I told myself, keep going. They'll see your worth. But worth, I learned, is fragile when it rests in the wrong hands. The final blow came on a Tuesday morning, ordinary in every way until Harold called me into the boardroom. The blinds were half drawn, the air faintly smelling of carpet cleaner. Colleagues were already seated. Harold cleared his throat. "Before we begin, I have an announcement. As of today, Susan will be promoted to Director of Client Relations." Applause. Smiles. A few nods of approval. "And Patricia," Harold continued, his tone so casual it almost felt rehearsed, "will remain in her current role. Of course, we're grateful for her consistency." Laughter rippled, soft but sharp. I felt heat flood my face, but I stayed still. No tears. No protests. Only silence. Harold glanced at me, his smirk almost daring me to object. That's when I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a plain white envelope, and slid it across the table. Inside was not resignation. Not yet. It was a record. Copies of contracts, side deals, and financial discrepancies Harold thought no one noticed. Years of quiet observation. Years of patience. He didn't open it. He didn't care. Not yet. But one day soon he would. And when he did, it wouldn't just end his career. It would erase the empire he thought was untouchable. The boardroom scene should have been enough humiliation for one lifetime. But Harold wasn't finished with me. The days that followed were a masterclass in erasure. Emails that used to land in my inbox now went straight to Susan. Invitations to client dinners skipped over my calendar. At meetings, Harold introduced her as the brains of the operation. And I was reduced to the woman who fetched data, who stayed behind to finalize details. One afternoon, while Susan presented my carefully built strategy for the Walker account, Harold interrupted her mid-sentence to praise her visionary thinking. I sat in the corner, silent, my pen pressed so hard into my notepad that the tip snapped. Nobody noticed. But I noticed everything. I watched the way Susan slipped into Harold's rhythm, echoing his jokes, finishing his sentences. I watched the way Harold leaned on her arm at conferences, parading her like a prize. I watched as people began to forget who had written the very foundations of the strategies she now claimed as her own. Each moment of invisibility hardened me, sharpened me. And yet, I played the role Harold assigned me, steady, reliable, invisible. Because only in invisibility can revenge truly grow. It all came to a head during the quarterly review. The conference hall was filled with staff, shareholders, clients dialing in from across the globe. It was meant to be Susan's big moment. Her first time leading the quarterly presentation as director. Harold kicked it off with his usual arrogance. "Today," he boomed into the microphone, "you'll see the future of our company. And that future is Susan." Applause thundered. Cameras flashed. I sat near the back, my hands folded neatly on my lap. Susan walked to the podium in a sharp crimson dress, confidence radiating from her like perfume. She launched into the slides, Slides I had designed, numbers I had crunched, insights I had prepared. But she dressed them in charm and flair. The audience nodded, impressed. Until the fifth slide. That's when her numbers stumbled. The figures didn't add up. The projection line veered off course. I recognized the mistake instantly. It wasn't hers. It was Harold's. He had insisted on adjusting the numbers to look bolder. I had warned him in an email I still had, time-stamped, filed, and printed. Susan froze for just a second, but in that second the audience shifted. Whispers rose. Investors frowned. Harold, sitting proudly in the front row, leaned forward and whispered something. Susan nodded, adjusted, kept going. But the crack had formed. By the end of the presentation, applause was polite, measured. No thunder this time. I slipped out before anyone noticed. My face was calm, but inside, my resolve burned brighter. The real explosion came later that evening. Harold stormed into my office, his tie loosened, his face flushed with rage. Where the hell were you during that disaster? You could have corrected her. You could have fixed it. I looked up from my desk, my voice even. You told me to stay in the background. His eyes narrowed. Don't get clever with me, Patricia. This company can't afford your sulking. Either get in line or he didn't finish. Because I slid another envelope across the desk. This one thinner than the first. A taste. A small proof of what I held. A signed contract showing a conflict of interest. A transaction that shouldn't have existed. He froze. His eyes flicked over the paper, then up at me. What is this? Just something I noticed, I said softly. I'm steady, remember? I see things. I keep records. Always have. For the first time in years, Harold didn't have a comeback. His jaw tightened, his hand trembled slightly as he folded the paper back into the envelope. I stood, smoothed my jacket, and walked to the door. Good night, Harold, I said. And as I left, I knew. The cracks in his empire had begun. For weeks after the quarterly debacle, Harold walked the halls with sharper eyes. He barked at assistants, snapped at interns, and even Susan bore the weight of his temper. But when he passed me, he only gave a quick glance, half suspicion, half unease. He didn't know what I had. That was the beauty of it. He only knew I had something. And uncertainty is a poison far stronger than any truth. I began quietly the way I always did. Step 1 was information. Every contract Harold had signed, every side deal he had whispered about in hushed tones, I already had copies. Years of being steady Patricia had made me invisible, but also indispensable. Nobody noticed when I lingered by the printer, when I saved extra versions of emails, when I asked for a backup file. Step 2 was allies. I reached out to people Harold had stepped on. Junior managers overlooked for promotions, partners he had cut out of deals, clients he had dismissed with arrogance. They didn't trust me at first. I was Harold's shadow after all. But once I showed them proof, once I laid out his manipulations, their silence cracked. Anger, long buried, bubbled to the surface. Step 3 was timing. A plan like this couldn't be rushed. It had to feel natural, like Harold's empire collapsing under its own weight. If it looked like sabotage, I'd be burned along with him. But if it looked like consequence, then I would rise untouched. The first move came during the investor dinner. It was a grand event at the Carlton Hotel, chandeliers glittering, wine glasses catching the light. Harold strutted across the room with Susan on his arm, his voice booming with promises of growth and vision. I arrived late, deliberately. Quiet. No fanfare. When dessert was served, I excused myself and slipped a slim folder into the hands of one of the firm's oldest investors, a man Harold had cheated years ago in a merger deal. Inside were documents, emails, contracts, all bearing Harold's signature. The man's eyes widened as he read, his jaw tightening. He looked up once, straight at Harold, then back down at the pages. I didn't need to say a word. The second move came weeks later, at a board meeting. Susan was presenting again, this time more cautious, more rehearsed. Harold sat stiffly beside her, scanning the room as if waiting for an ambush. And it came. Not from me, but from a board member who had received an anonymous package 2 nights earlier. A package filled with discrepancies in Harold's expense reports. Evidence of company funds redirected into personal accounts. Harold, the board member said evenly. Perhaps you'd like to explain this? The room fell silent. All eyes turned. Harold stammered, shifted, tried to dismiss it as a clerical error. But the seed was planted. Doubt had entered the room, and doubt spreads faster than fire. I sat in the corner, taking notes, my face expressionless. Inside, I felt the walls of his empire begin to tremble. The third move was the boldest. The Walker account, the company's crown jewel, the deal I had nurtured for over a decade, was up for renewal. Harold was desperate to keep it, parading Susan as the visionary leader who would guide it into the future. But I had been quietly meeting with the Walkers behind closed doors. They remembered who had saved their first deal, who had stayed up until dawn recalculating figures when everyone else had given up. They remembered the woman who listened, who steadied the ship while Harold chased glory. When the renewal contract was signed, it bore my name, not Harold's, not Susan's. And when the announcement hit the press, it was my picture beside the Walkers, my words quoted in headlines. That night, Harold stormed into my office again. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. "You've been undermining me," he hissed. "Don't think I don't know. I made you, Patricia. Without me, you're nothing." I leaned back in my chair, calm, deliberate. "Without you, Harold, I was always everything. You just didn't notice." I slid another envelope across the desk, thicker this time. Inside was the full dossier. Years of fraud, conflicts of interest, off-the-books accounts. Enough to end him. He snatched it up, flipped through, his hands trembling. "If this gets out." "It already has," I said softly. His face drained of color. "Check tomorrow's paper." That was the moment I had waited 15 years for. Not shouting, not triumph, but silence. The silence of a man who finally saw the ruin he had built with his own hands. And I, steady Patricia, had only been there to keep the records. The morning after my last conversation with Harold, the headlines broke. Executive fraud allegations surface at Stratton & Cole. Anonymous dossier raises questions over CEO's finances. Board to launch emergency investigation. Harold's name was everywhere. And so was mine, quoted as the long-standing executive who had been asked to step in and steady operations. By noon, his phone was ringing nonstop. By evening, it had stopped altogether. The board moved quickly. Investors demanded clarity, clients whispered of pulling out, and regulators circled like hawks. Harold shouted, raged, slammed doors. But the more he fought, the guiltier he looked. The more Susan tried to smooth things over, the more she looked like a pawn. I stayed calm, measured. I offered solutions, not excuses. I came to meetings with facts, not anger. I didn't need to push him out. The tide was already pulling him under. One afternoon, the board called an emergency vote. Harold arrived late, his tie crooked, his eyes hollow. Susan trailed behind, clutching her notes as if they could save her. The chairman spoke first. "Given the evidence presented and the damage to this firm's reputation, we move to remove Harold Whitmore as CEO, effective immediately." The vote was swift. Hands rose one by one. No hesitation. Only Harold voted against. When the final tally was read, silence filled the room. Harold stood trembling, his face pale. "You'll regret this," he whispered, voice cracking. "You'll all regret this." Then he turned to me. For the first time in 15 years, I saw fear in his eyes, not of me, but of what came next. Susan tried to salvage her position. She cornered me in the hallway the next day, her smile stretched thin. "Patricia," she said, her voice sugary, "we should talk. I know things have shifted, but I want you to know I've always respected you." I looked at her, this woman who had mocked me in meetings, who had taken credit for work she couldn't even explain, who had laughed when Harold dismissed me. "Respect isn't something you say," I replied evenly. "It's something you show. And you never did." Her face tightened, the mask slipping. "You think you've won? Harold will bounce back. Men like him always do." "Maybe," I said softly. "But not here. Not with me watching." I walked away, leaving her standing in the corridor, her heels suddenly too loud against the marble floor. The weeks that followed were a storm. Investigations opened. Harold's accounts were frozen. Reporters camped outside his home. shouting questions he refused to answer. Susan faded fast. Without Harold, her charm carried no weight. Clients refused her calls. Colleagues avoided her. Within a month, she resigned quietly, her resignation email sent at midnight, unread by most until morning. And me? I was called into a private meeting with the board. The chairman cleared his throat, glanced around the table, then looked directly at me. "Patricia," he said, "you've been the backbone of this firm for years. In this crisis, you've shown not just competence but leadership. The board is unanimous. We'd like you to step in as interim CEO." For a moment, I couldn't speak. 15 years of silence, of swallowing my pride, of being overlooked, it all pressed against my chest. Finally, I nodded. "I'll accept, but only if we do things differently this time." The room leaned in. No more shadows. No more vanity projects. We build this firm on substance, not ego. If we do that, we don't just survive, we lead. The board murmured in agreement. For the first time, my voice filled the room. And it was heard. The night I was officially announced, I sat alone in my office. The city lights shimmered through the glass, 1,000 points of gold against the dark. On my desk lay a letter. Handwritten. From Harold. "Patricia, you think you've beaten me. But you only had power because I gave you a place to stand. Without me, you'd still be invisible. One day, you'll see that you are nothing without someone like me to fight against." I read it twice. Then I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. Maybe Harold was right in some twisted way. He had been the obstacle that forged me, the shadow that taught me how to move in silence. But he was wrong about one thing. I wasn't nothing. I was everything he had underestimated. Months later, at a conference in Chicago, I took the stage to speak. The hall was filled with industry leaders, reporters, and young executives eager for advice. I looked out at them, steady calm. "I've learned something," I began. "Power isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the voice people turn to when everything else falls apart. For years, I was invisible. But invisibility has a strength. It teaches you to see what others miss, to prepare when others are careless. And when the time comes, it allows you to step into the light, not as a surprise, but as a certainty." The applause rose like a wave, washing over me. For the first time in my career, I wasn't clapping for someone else. The room was clapping for me. Harold disappeared from the industry. Whispers said he moved overseas, chasing smaller ventures, trying to rebuild. Susan was last seen running workshops on executive leadership at second-rate events. And me? I led the firm into a new era. Deals grew. Trust deepened. The company flourished, not because of noise but because of steadiness. I had been the shadow. Now I was the light. And I had no intention of fading again. Years later, I still remember the quiet moments more than the chaos. The late nights in the office, the soft hum of fluorescent lights, the smell of stale coffee lingering over spreadsheets and contracts. I carry those memories like a secret compass. They remind me who I was, and how carefully I moved through a world that rarely noticed me. I often walk past the old conference room, now bright and bustling with new teams. Once, that space was the arena of humiliation, where my efforts were dismissed and my presence ignored. Today, it hums with strategy sessions, laughter, and collaboration. The air smells faintly of fresh ink and polished wood. I pause sometimes, just to breathe it in, to remember the tension that once filled these walls. I've learned that power isn't explosive. It doesn't announce itself with shouts or threats. It creeps quietly, patiently, like sunlight slipping through blinds. I became a threat not because I sought vengeance, but because I knew truth had weight, and I learned how to let it fall. Every report, every email, every carefully preserved note became a brick in a foundation I built while pretending to kneel. People still ask me how I handled it. The betrayal, the years of being invisible, the personal cost. I tell them the same thing. Patience isn't weakness, and endurance isn't resignation. Strength often lives in silence, in observation, in preparation. I am not proud of the way it took me 15 years to stand fully in the light, but I am proud of the woman who finally did. Sometimes I wonder what Harold thinks now. I imagine him in some distant office, chasing deals and authority he no longer commands. And I feel nothing. Not glee, not bitterness, just relief. Relief that the lesson was mine to learn, and I survived it whole. I've realized that revenge isn't about punishment. It's about reclamation. It's about stepping into a life you were once denied, claiming space you were once denied, and walking forward with your dignity intact. I am not the shadow anymore. I am the steady light that casts it away. And in the quiet of my office, as the city lights flicker through the glass, I smile, not at the ruin of another, but at the woman I've become. Steady, unseen, unshakable, and finally fully visible.